Welcome to Best of Reddit. Be sure to subscribe as we upload new content daily. First revenge story. Taking out the trash on my way out. I had been a truck driver for years, and in an effort to raise a family and actually have a home life, I decided to take my skills to work for a garbage company. The company I started working for a huge one in the United States. It came with decent pay, great benefits, and the perfect work schedule. Their equipment was substandard, but I didn't care much. The employees at the company, however, were voting on unionizing the location in response to the complaints about management. I really didn't care either way because I was so new that I had zero complaints. Immediately after the contract vote, the operations manager confronted me about why I voted to accept the union contract, and stated he knew I did because only 3 people voted not to, and he knew who they were. I just walked away from the conflict and focused on doing my job to the best of my abilities. I worked hard and would even work as I was eating my lunch on a daily basis, and pushed myself to excel at being efficient at everything I did for them. I came to work sick several times when I should have just called in sick, and covered many shifts when others called in themselves. One would have thought an employer would appreciate people that are so devoted to their job. In fact, many of the employees there worked just as hard as I did. This employer, however, automatically deducted 30 minutes of time for lunch from each employee, but would actually harass employees that actually took their lunch break. They would push employees to perform more and more each day so that drivers were actually speeding to keep from being written up. Supervisors and managers never commended good performance, and would actually make comments such as, "If you don't like it here, McDonald's is hiring," and "There is always someone else waiting to take your job tomorrow, because drivers are a dime a dozen." Vehicles were not properly maintained when it came to comfort. Equipment such as air conditioning never worked. It was no wonder the employees had decided to unionize. This went on for a couple of years before I found myself a target of such treatment. They started pushing me to drive faster, and I refused. They daily came and tried to threaten me with disciplinary action if I didn't improve my performance that I knew was already beyond what I was required to do. One day I finally had enough and told my supervisor, "I only have 2 speeds. If you don't like this one, you sure as heck aren't going to like the other." He replied, "What is that supposed to mean?" I then stated, "Keep pushing and you will find out." He did, so I showed him what that meant. I started driving the speed limit everywhere I went, did only what I had to, and noted down each and every delay I faced, for months. I took every lunch, and every break I was entitled to, once even sitting with an office employee at a table right outside the general manager's window as she shared food he had provided to office personnel. I knew this was making them mad. Finally one day they called me into the office and started yelling at me. I informed him that I wanted my shop steward to be present for the meeting. They reluctantly agreed and then proceeded to pull out a stack of my logs out from files to go through during the meeting, in an effort to fire me. When my shop steward arrived and the meeting started, they went through log after log for about an hour before finally conceding that I had done nothing wrong. The meeting ended with them asking me not to share its outcome with anyone else. I just smiled and walked out. As I walked down the stairs from the manager's office, a crowd of employees stood waiting to see the outcome. When they saw my smile, the crowd broke into laughter. I returned to my job and resumed my routine of working hard, but continued to take my lunch breaks. Within a week, as I inspected my vehicle, I noticed it was suddenly equipped with a GPS device. This was at a time when such devices were just hitting the market, so I knew the harassment was far from over, but I never allowed the opportunity for them to find fault. Before long, my regular truck was regularly taken out of service for repairs, and the replacement I was then assigned to was a rusty old death trap. I started to appeal to the union for assistance, but was told there was little they could do since it didn't violate the union contract. I decided I would start looking for other employment, but not before enacting my revenge. For the previous couple of years, the company had assigned me to drive loads of trash to a landfill in the next county, because the disposal fee was much cheaper. When they first instructed me to do so, my supervisor told me not to tell landfill employees in our county what we were doing because it was a breach of their contract with the county we worked in. However, since they were now harassing me into quitting, I made it a point to be less than subtle that I was routinely disappearing for long intervals. When a county employee started asking where I had been, I sheepishly replied, "Oh, just over at XYZ County." He replied, "You aren't supposed to go there." I answered, "Really?" He then made it a habit of asking where I had been whenever I would disappear for prolonged periods of time. Each time I would reply, Oh, I'm not supposed to say. This went on for months as management continued to push me toward quitting. Finally, the day arrived, and I walked off the job and quickly found work elsewhere. A few months later, I picked up the local newspaper to find a front page article about how the company had violated the county contract and was being sued. A later article read that lawsuit ended with a settlement of more than $800,000 being paid to the county. I found out from employees still working there that the corporate office terminated all of the managers as a result. I sometimes miss the co-workers I once had, and miss the job itself, but it was justice enough to take the trash out as I left. I was regarded as somewhat of a hero after that by those left behind. As for the immediate supervisor that directly harassed me each day, he kept his job when new management came on board. However, he insisted that he deserved a raise, and stated that he would have to quit if he didn't receive one. The new GM told him that he would need the request in writing in order to try to negotiate with the corporation. When he handed the GM the ultimatum, the GM replied, "I will take this as your letter of resignation." And now, revenge on home buyers. Last year Thanksgiving, a group of us were together and a 30-something couple were talking about how much they were screwing over the owner of their soon-to-be new house. They had negotiated back and forth for a low price, had asked for several contingencies, had nickel and dimmed every last thing they could out of the inspection. At one point the new owner had even threatened to walk away from the deal. They were pretty proud of their tactics and how great their realtor was. One of the over 55 people finally laughed and said, "You aren't going to come out ahead like you think you are. There are consequences for your actions. Trust me, the seller always wins." She then told the story of her first house. She and her husband saved and scraped for years, before they were able to buy a 100-year-old fixed-upper. This was in the 1990s and interest rates were higher. They bought during a seller's market. A major employer in their town closed, relocated. The town was plunged into a recession. No jobs, people moved away and housing prices dropped. 4 years later she and her husband are getting a divorce. It is now a buyer's market. Their house sits on the market for over a year. Finally, they get an offer. The buyer's realtor was related to them and was a shrew. The offer was less than what they paid for the house, and they had made several costly upgrades. The buyer tried asking for several changes and cash back at closing. After they did the inspection, they kept demanding for things to be done. They started with all the lower cost things, new smoke detectors, snaking a drain, and every 2 to 3 days, it was something else they wanted done. Finally, she and her husband had to tell her realtor they had no money left, they couldn't afford what the buyer was asking for, and they had no choice but to let the buyer out of the contract. The buyer backed off the repairs, but then wanted a couple pieces of furniture that were family antiques. When that didn't work, they wanted a lower price. She and her ex were about one step from a nervous breakdown and were convinced the buyers would walk. She told a few more stories about how the buyers and inspector were late an hour for the inspection. They brought their dogs in the house, she was very allergic, the dogs peed and pooped in an area that had new carpet, etc. She lived in a state where buyers and sellers all meet around a table in a lawyer's office for closing at the same time. Roughly an hour before that meeting, the sellers and realtor do a final walkthrough. The night, early morning, while it was still dark, before closing she dumped around 100 gallons, 30 pounds of salt water on the grass and bushes. She turned down the temperature on the water heater. She replaced toilet paper rolls with almost empty ones. The next morning she and a very good friend sat a half a block away and waited for them to finish the inspection. Once they left, the friend went into the house. She waited a few minutes and drove to the closing. The new owners were about 10 minutes early to the signing and she was about 5 minutes late. She was very slow about signing the papers and a couple of times asked to have things repeated. While she was signing things, her friend was removing a couple of boards in the attic and adding a mama mouse and her new litter to the attic. He also removed some lattice work and threw a termite's nest under the front porch. Then he sprayed some sugar water around the coal chute and exterior basement cellar entrance. Even she knew turning down the temperature on the water heater was petty, but she also hoped that even the one cold shower would start their day off lousy. She moved out of the area, but a year later when she was visiting, the grass had not recovered. She noticed the attic windows had all been replaced and a couple of old huge trees were trimmed back. 3 years later, there was a new front porch. This was an old house with a wrap-around front porch, so no cheap fix. She later heard the people who bought the house lost it through bankruptcy in less than 5 years. Fast forward to this year at Thanksgiving. We were smaller in number, but the same couple was there. They were a bit deflated. While the previous owners didn't do anything quite as bad as the woman in her 50s, it was a pretty tight-knit neighborhood. All of the neighbors had heard blow-by-blow details of their negotiation tactics. They were very cool to them upon meeting, and even a year later they don't feel very welcome. The neighbors will gather in the street and visit, now with some distancing. Whenever they try to walk over and join the conversation, the group breaks up. They don't think it's fair that the neighborhood kids don't play with their kids. One of the more blunt neighbors told the husband, "Your child is welcome to play with my kids in my house. But I don't want my kids around you." They are considering moving again. They aren't bad people, but it reminded me that buying a house may be a business transaction. But, like the woman said, there's consequences for every action.